Good morning, everybody. Good morning, good morning. Thank you all for coming. Can everyone hear me okay? This room has very, very good acoustics, so I appreciate it. Thank you all for coming. Yes. Oh, perfect. I'm a little tall for these mics. Okay. So thank you all very much for coming. We appreciate you being here. Good morning and welcome everybody to today's Mark Samuelin Distinguished Speaker Series conversation about the role of NATO. We'll be hearing shortly from Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Public Diplomacy, Ms. Carmen Romero, welcome, but who just touched down in Miami, and we can't wait to hear about her visit. But before we do, there's a few things that we have to say. Ms. Romero's visit comes at a time of heightened importance and responsibility for NATO, not seen in many generations. War has returned to Europe, nuclear tensions are running high, and misinformation tests the foundations of our free societies. In times like these, there's truly nothing better than talking, listening, and learning. We're therefore very grateful for the support of our partners, without whom this program would not be possible. My sincere appreciation to Miami-Dade College Honors College, the Wolfson campus, and MDC more broadly. Our gratitude as well to the FIU Stephen J. Green School for School of International and Public Affairs for your partnership on this and many other programs as we build our relationship too. So thank you, Shlomi, for being here. To the students, faculty, and members of the wider community who join us today for what promises to be a fascinating session, thank you for taking your time to be here. My name is Aaron Rosen, and I have the pleasure to serve as the president of the World Affairs Council of Miami. We are a nonpartisan 501c3 nonprofit organization with the mission to increase local access to high quality information on international affairs in our community and around the world. The goal of this speaker series in particular is to provide our community with a greater opportunity to hear from and interact with practitioners of international affairs. And we hope you enjoyed today's session and that you leave here having become inspired, having learned something, and having made new networks and made new relationships that allow you to advance in your respective professional, academic, and intellectual endeavors. I'll be moderating this conversation, but before I do, we have invited some key individuals who have made this program possible to say a few words. Please allow me to begin by introducing the Interim Dean Shlomi Dinar. The Interim Dean Shlomi Dinar of the Stephen J. Green School of International Affairs is also a professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations. His academic focus is in environmental politics, environmental institutions, environment and security, hydropolitics, climate change, terrorism, conflict resolution, and international negotiation. And it's a pleasure for us to have him here with us today because the Green School is notable for having become the first Florida university to have been named a member of the prestigious Association for Professional Schools of International Affairs. So congratulations on that. Among his other accomplishments, he's also been invited to give talks to multilateral organizations around the world, including also at a NATO Advanced Research Workshop. So it's a pleasure to have you here today. Shlomi Dinar, it's an honor. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Aaron, and good morning. It's really it's a pleasure to be here at MDC and work together. And really, the Green School's Dorothea Green Lecture Series is privileged to be co-sponsoring this event with Miami-Dade College's Wolfson campus and its Honors College, and of course, the World Affairs Council of Miami. So thank you for this wonderful invitation. We're really honored to be here. We're very honored to have Carmen Romero with us today and look forward to what you will be sharing about the role of NATO. For those of you not familiar with the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs, I'd like to share a bit about us and why our participation today is so fitting. Through our 8 departments that bridge the social sciences and humanities, along with 17 centers, institutes, and programs, the Green School addresses many consequential international issues as we prepare the leaders of tomorrow who will tackle those specific issues. Our amazing Model UN team is ranked number 3 in North America and has been ranked a top 5 team for the past 10 years. About a year ago, as Aaron mentioned, the Green School was named a full member of the Association of Professional Schools of International Affairs, or APSIA as it's known, making it the first university in Florida to achieve the prestigious designation. We are one of only 25 United States and 38 APSIUM member schools in the world. We are in the company of universities such as Princeton, Harvard, Columbia, Johns Hopkins, Stanford, Georgetown, and Duke. The Green School has programs that address the Transatlantic Alliance and the commitment to preserve security and democracy, such as our European and Eurasian Studies program, which houses the Miami, Florida Jean Monnet Center of Excellence, as well as our Václav Havel program for human rights and democracy. Finally, in March, we held our inaugural annual Miami Conference on Global Democracy. More than 30 internationally renowned experts from government, academia, non-governmental organizations, and journalism examine forces that are contributing to the backsliding of democracy, as well as the ways democracy can be strengthened. The current fragile situation in Europe, precipitated by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the expansion of NATO, were among the topics explored that day as well. Of course, the accession of Finland, we talked about that earlier, and the prospect of Sweden joining NATO are very significant developments in European geopolitics. And the future of the organization and the involving challenges it faces are of great interest to us all. We eagerly await Carmen's thoughts on these matters and much more. So now, it's my pleasure to introduce the president of Miami-Dade College's Wolfson campus, Dr. Beatriz Gonzalez.
Thank you so much. Welcome everyone to the Wolfson campus. Good morning. It's a pleasure to have you all here. Miami-Dade College has 8 campuses, multiple outreach centers, an online division. But here at Wolfson campus, we know we're at the best campus. And in fact, we say we're at the best campus because we're here at the heart of it all, here at the heart of government, finance, tech, arts and culture, and it really creates a wonderful laboratory for our students. And it also creates a wonderful backdrop for this conversation here today. Miami-Dade College is a community college, so that makes us of and for the community. And as such, we see ourselves as having a responsibility to both support and help create the public sphere. The public sphere where informed individuals come together to exchange ideas so that we can create a democracy that we believe we can all live by, a democracy that is served and shaped by us as citizens. So thank you for making time. You didn't have to be here today, but you're making time to be part of the public sphere. It needs us, it is reliant on us in order to have the kind of democracy that we aspire to. So now it's my honor to introduce to you Ms. Carmen Romero. Carmen Romero was appointed NATO Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Public Diplomacy in October 2016. She joined NATO in May of 2004 as Deputy Spokesperson and Head of Press and Media, a position she held for 12 years. She has also been acting NATO spokesperson, including during the Russia-Georgia war in August 2008. Prior to this, Carmen had a long career as the Foreign Affairs Correspondent for EFE News Agency based at the United States in Geneva, Moscow, and Paris, covering events such as the revolution in Romania, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the war in Chechnya, the crisis in Kosovo, and the NATO campaign in the former Yugoslavia. From 2001 to 2004, she was the Defense and Foreign Affairs Correspondent for EFE News Agency to the European Union and NATO. During that period, she was also Special Envoy to Iraq and Afghanistan. Carmen has a master's degree in journalism and information science from la Universidad Complutense de Ciencias de la Información de Madrid. In 1996, she received an award for young journalists by the International Press Association in Madrid for her coverage of the war in Chechnya. Please join me in welcoming Carmen Romero.
Well, good morning. Thank you very much, Dean Diener, President Rosen, President Gonzalez, for hosting us today, for making this event happen, and for your kind words. I'm really delighted to be here. It's my first time in Miami, and I have to say that I feel at home because, you know, wherever you go, you hear Spanish. I'm from Spain, so it's such a delight. It's a beautiful city. But first of all, I want to thank the World Affairs Council of Miami, the Miami-Dade College, and the Florida International University. I really appreciate the fact that you are interested in international relations and NATO at this crucial time for European and transatlantic security, as you were saying earlier. So now I would like to share with you what NATO is doing in the new security environment, a security environment in which we face growing strategic competition, we face multiple hybrid challenges, and also, as you were saying, Aaron, we have war returned to Europe. We have a military conflict at the heart of Europe. But first of all, what is NATO? NATO is a political, military, it's not only a military, it's a political, military organization that has preserved peace in Europe and in North America for 74 years. That's a long time. NATO is an alliance based on the principles and the values of the United Nations Charter. The main goal of NATO is to protect the 1 billion citizens living in Europe and North America, and to protect them from security threats coming from any direction. And how do we do this? We do this politically and militarily. Politically, because we are consulting on a regular basis politically. NATO is a very political organization. And it's important to note the fact that NATO is the only organization in which Europe and North America sit together every day to consult on issues relevant for our shared security. How do we do this militarily? We do this with deterrence and defense. And the purpose of deterrence is to avoid, to prevent a conflict, to tell your potential adversary, don't mess with us, because we are prepared to defend ourselves. So deterrence is key in what we do, is actually our priority number one. And thanks to deterrence, we can preserve peace. I would like to share with you a few words about NATO's history, very fast. So during the Cold War, since 1949, when NATO was created, NATO had one job. What was that job? That job was to deter the Soviet Union, what we call collective defense. It is based on the principle that an attack against one can be considered an attack against all, what we call all for one, one for all. And the success of our deterrence against the Soviet Union saw the Cold War coming to an end without a shot being fired on European soil. Then, after the Cold War in the 1990s, for around 25 years, NATO took action outside of its borders, projecting stability in its neighborhood and contributing to bringing an end to a number of wars and conflicts in the Western Balkans. But also NATO had a very important role in fighting against international terrorism when this nation, the United States, was attacked on 9/11. What has made NATO very strong is the fact that it has continuously evolved and adapted to deal with the evolving security challenges. So as the world has changed, so has NATO. After the end of the Cold War, NATO built a strong partnership with Russia. I think it's also important to share this, to think about the fact that we were very, very closely together. So Russia actually became the closest partner of NATO. We developed a very solid political relationship, even if we knew there were issues that we will never agree on, and we also built a very sound practical cooperation. So during 3 decades, we built together a security architecture based on predictability, a rules-based international order. We did that together. But what happened? In 2014, Russia seriously challenged that order with the illegal annexation of Crimea and also occupying certain parts of the Donbass, which is a region, as you know, in Ukraine. So that was the beginning of the war against Ukraine. The war didn't start last year. It started in 2014 when Russia did that. And these actions by Russia were part of an assertive pattern by Moscow to use conventional but also hybrid tools to divide, to confuse, to distract, and to prevent unity of the West. So, in 2014, the threat perception in NATO evolved again, and Russia moved from being a partner to being a potential adversary. Also, the surge of ISIS in Iraq and in Syria moved the fight against international terrorism back into NATO's priorities agenda. Then, as we all know, in February of last year, 2022, Russia launched its full-fledged and unprovoked aggression against Ukraine. And this created the most serious military conflict in Europe since the end of the Second World War. With this aggression, Russia has undermined the Euro-Atlantic security architecture, and it has violated the international rules-based order and also the UN Charter. And Russia has moved from being a strategic partner in the 1990s, as I was saying, to being a potential adversary in 2014 with the first war against Ukraine, to now be a threat. Russia is now the most direct threat to our security, the security of the 31 member states of NATO, which includes North America and many countries in Europe. Last year, NATO approved at a summit in my home country, in Spain, a new strategic concept. What is the strategic concept of NATO? In the hierarchy of NATO documents, the strategic concept is the most important document, policy document, after the Washington Treaty. The Washington Treaty is our chart. So this new strategic concept is the new political strategy for NATO for the next decade. The new strategic concept identifies two main security threats for NATO: Russia and terrorism. At the same time, the strategic concept prepares the alliance for a decade of instability, for a more dangerous and competitive security environment. It is a blueprint for how to take NATO into the future in a world of growing strategic competition, where we see a number of authoritarian powers challenge our values and our principles, and using hybrid tools such as economic coercion and manipulation of energy to achieve their goals. The new NATO strategic concept makes clear that our security challenges are global. They are not regional anymore, and we see this now with the Russian aggression against Ukraine. The new strategic concept also prepares NATO to deal with new challenges, for example, cyber, for example, space, hybrid, but also to deal with emerging and disruptive technologies. These are very important for our security. And the new strategic concept also speaks for the first time about China and the fact that the rise of China is representing a number of challenges for our values, for our security, and for our interests. So we need to understand what it means, the fact that China is coming closer to us. Because China is the second economic power in the world, and China is the second military power in the world. But China doesn't follow any arms controls mechanism, unlike us. We support control. China is developing nuclear weapons without any control mechanism. But China is not an adversary. I was speaking about the challenge. There is a difference between challenge and being an adversary. It's very important to have a dialogue with China, to understand China better, and also China is a very influential power. So we don't consider China an adversary, but a challenge, as I was saying, to our security, to our interests, and to our values. The new strategic concept of NATO considers collective defense to be our priority again, which was the priority, remember, when we were created. And this mission is supported by three core tasks. The first one, deterrence and defense. The second is crisis prevention and management. And the third is cooperative security. to work with partners has become more important than ever because, as I was saying, the security is now global. A few words about Ukraine. So what has been NATO's response to the full-fledged war of aggression by Russia of Ukraine? First of all, in the months preceding the invasion, what NATO did was to anticipate to our citizens what President Putin was preparing. We did that to explain and to show to our citizens what President Putin was preparing, and also to forge unity, because we knew already that unity could be our strength against President Putin. And how did we do that? We did it by declassifying intelligence information. We have never declassified intelligence information in this way. We have done it in an unprecedented way to show to the world the military build-up that President Putin was putting together along the Ukrainian border, while at the same time he was saying, I have no intention to invade, basically to enter or to attack Ukraine. We did that, as I said, to forge unity and to have the support of our public opinion, because we are an alliance of democracies. There is nothing we can do if we don't have the support of our people. And when Russia launched its full-fledged invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February of last year, I can tell you that the two sides of the Atlantic, Europe and North America, were united politically to take a number of very important decisions, mainly two decisions. Our decision to support Ukraine for as long as it takes, and also the decision to increase our deterrence and defense. Focus on three main lines of effort. The first one is to reinforce our deterrence and defense, to prevent an escalation, because this is what we really want. We have to do whatever we can to prevent the extension of the war in Ukraine to our territory. How do we do that? By increasing our deterrence and by increasing our military presence in the eastern part of the alliance. So since 2014, with the first war against Ukraine, NATO increased already its presence in the Baltic states and in Poland. As a follow-up, as a consequence to the full-fledged invasion, we have increased also our military presence in other countries from Eastern Europe, such as Romania, Hungary, Slovakia. So our military presence has increased considerably. And this is to tell President Putin, don't even think about attacking the territory of NATO, because you will have 31 members against you. This is what deterrence is all about. The second main line of effort has been to support Ukraine in its right of self-defense, which I said is a right enshrined in the United Nations Charter. So we have been supporting Ukraine both with political assistance, but also with non-lethal assistance, because NATO doesn't own weapons, so we have not provided military support as such to Ukraine, but our member states have done so. And our third line of effort is to be part of the international coalition that is defending the rules-based international order in the UN Charter. So we have been part of this all along. And I have to say that our unity has been our strength. And we have also seen the importance of the US and Europe working together. We wouldn't have been able to support Ukraine in the way we have done without being together. And this is one of the miscalculations of President Putin, because he thought we were not going to be so united. So what is at stake in Ukraine is not only the security of Ukraine, the territorial integrity, the sovereignty of Ukraine, their democracy. It's also the defense of our own security, it's the defense of our values, the defense of our way of life, because this is actually what the Ukrainians have lost. I know that Ukraine is far away from the United States. In Europe, Ukraine is really our neighbor, and our security is really linked to each other. So it's you know, I have been in Ukraine where peaceful people going to the parks, students like you going to the university from one day to another. They had to leave the university. They lost everything they had. They didn't have a choice. So this is what it's really at stake, our own security, our values, and our way of life. So if Putin wins, our world will become more dangerous, because then authoritarian regimes will see and will consider that they can use force to achieve their objectives and to also change borders, for example. So this is why we cannot allow President Putin to win this war against Ukraine. Our aim, our strategy, the aim of organizations like NATO, the European Union, is to help Ukraine achieve a fair and a sustainable peace, is to allow and to give the tools to Ukraine to retake as much territory as possible, its own territory, to be in a strong position at the time of peace negotiations, because usually wars end at the negotiating table. But the strength of negotiators will depend on how the situation is in the battlefield. So now we need to do whatever we can to support Ukraine retake as much territory as possible. And something that our NATO Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, very often says is that if President Zelensky stops fighting, Ukraine will cease to exist because it will be absorbed by Russia. But if President Putin stops fighting and withdraws from Ukraine, the war will stop tomorrow. So that's, I think, very clear. So what is at stake, as I said, is the future of our own security, the international base order, and we need to support Ukraine as long as it takes. Thank you.
Thank you, Carmen. That was really wonderful and very comprehensive, and I think very timely, given, for all of us, the relevance of NATO in the news, but also the complexity of the conflict, of NATO's role in the wider world. And so we're really happy to have you here with us today to dig into some of these details, more thoroughly. I think the first point that you touched on in your opening remarks is really important. With each passing year, the Second World War and the aftermath of it gets more and more distant from us, and the reason for and the success of NATO also becomes a bit more blurry in the minds of a lot of people. But I think touching on the fact that NATO's ultimate goal and its initial purpose was to deter war in Europe, and it had done so successfully over the entirety of the Cold War, can't be forgotten and needs to be remembered more often. So I appreciate you touching on that. Brings me to my first question. You had mentioned the role of NATO during the Cold War, which was essentially also not just to deter war in Europe, but also to act as a check against the Soviet Union and affiliated Warsaw Pact countries as well, too, across the continent. Countries like Poland, Hungary, East Germany, and others who were outside of the Soviet Union proper, but within the communist world's sphere of influence in the Eastern Bloc. Since the end of the Cold War and the Soviet Union's dissolution, much of those Warsaw Pact countries now find themselves as NATO members. Critics of this alliance, of NATO, will point to this as proof of expansionism and encroachment on Moscow, and some may even claim it's a contradiction of prior Western commitments made not to do so. I was wondering, well, of course, this criticism doesn't at all take into consideration the agency that independent countries have to choose their own destiny. Nonetheless, it's something that we hear very readily in our political news. So I was wondering if you could detail the post-Cold War integration of ex-communist countries into NATO and address the claim that sometimes makes the rounds about the integration of these countries provoking Russia into war. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. That's a very relevant question. Thank you for asking that. And you also provided elements of the answer, which was basically these countries became independent. They became free, and they had the right to choose their security affiliations and to which organizations they wanted to belong to. So that's what they did. They asked for membership. It's not that NATO has an open door policy, but NATO doesn't go knocking at the doors of nations saying, asking, do you want to join us? We don't do that. We have the Washington Treaty. So the Washington Treaty says that European countries in the Euro-Atlantic area who wish to become members of NATO can apply to do so, and they have to contribute to the security of the organization. So that's very important, and that's what they did. I have to say that NATO was always very transparent with Russia. I was speaking about the 3 decades of collaboration with Russia, we signed many documents, and one of them is the Founding Act that really details our partnership. And in that document, for example, Russia accepted the right of nations from the former Soviet Pact to become, or the Soviet Union to become members of, to basically have the right to choose their security affiliations. So first of all, Russia had accepted the fact that NATO could have new members joining, and also accepted the fact that there was these countries had territorial integrity, which is something that Russia has violated. So these nations applied. They had to do a lot of work, because I can tell you it's not easy to meet the requirements to enter the alliance. It's a political security alliance, so there are many, many requirements. It's different from joining the European Union, but very similar in the sense that you need to do a lot of reforms across the board to qualify to become a member. So that's what they did, and they slowly entered NATO as they were prepared to join the alliance. Every time we had a new wave of countries from Eastern Europe joining NATO, we discussed it with Russia, because as I was saying, we had a very active and very lively political dialogue, and that was part of our political dialogue. So every time that we had new countries applying to NATO, the Russians would come and complain. But they knew about it, and we were briefing them about it. So we were saying, these countries are applying, they are working hard, and they could become members of NATO. So transparency has been the priority for us, to be not to hide anything to Russia. Of course, your deterrence, you don't give the details to your potential adversary, or but on new nations joining NATO, we have been extremely transparent, and Russia also accepted that in a way by signing the Founding Act that really fixed and institutionalize the partnership between NATO and Russia. So having more nations entering the alliance and becoming full members has made our alliance stronger. It's about providing an umbrella of security, and now we have over 1 million people living in the 31 members of NATO. And as you were referring to, with Finland entering NATO in April of this year, we have doubled the border with Russia. NATO has doubled the border, but we have been not hiding anything to Russia. So we have always been transparent, and it's the right of these nations to decide, as you were saying, their destiny.
Absolutely. Thank you for clarifying about that and offering that detail. We'll come back to Europe and Ukraine and Russia in a moment. There's much to discuss, but I wanted to take a quick sidestep to something that gets significantly less attention. Though often perceived by the general public as focused exclusively on North America and Europe, one of the first major challenges that actually sparked life into early NATO was the outbreak of the Korean War. More recently, as you mentioned, Carmen, NATO has been involved in the Middle East, South Asia, Africa. So I was wondering if you could share a bit more detail about NATO's role in these regions, and maybe in particular, given what's happening right now in Turkey, if you could look at the role that NATO has played in the lingering legacy of the Syrian civil war, and to help us understand that. I think it's less discussed, and I think we would use the opportunity of your visit to hear a bit more about that. And maybe also, if there's time, a bit about Afghanistan, since I understand you were also previously posted there, and I'm sure you have a lot to say about the withdrawal and NATO's legacy there.
So I spoke about 3 core tasks that NATO has. So cooperative security is the third one, and this is how we work with our partners in these many areas across the world. Partnerships have always been important for NATO. We have over 40 partner nations, and with the war in Ukraine, we see the even more importance of working with partners, because security has become global. So we have partners in the Middle East, in Northern Africa. We have increased our work with our partners in the Indo-Pacific, and this is much also related to China, because our partners in the Indo-Pacific know China very well. And last year, for example, at the summit in Spain, we invited the head of state and government of our 4 Indo-Pacific partners, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and South Korea. And we are increasing both our practical cooperation and our political dialogue with the partners in the Indo-Pacific to work together on basically the same security challenges that we face, and also in defense of our values. We also have one partner in Latin America, which is Colombia. We have a very developed political dialogue with Colombia, and also a very strong partnership and cooperation program. So what we do with these partners is to basically talk about the defense of our values, and also work together to address current and future security challenges together. So this is, and what we do is also support many of our partners if they so wish, because they are the ones who decide what kind of partnership they want to have with NATO. With, for example, capacity building, defense capacity building, we are helping many countries in the Middle East, in Northern Africa, make their defense institutions democratic, stronger, in line with the democratic security institutions that we have in Europe and in North America. So there is a lot of work that we do to project stability, to help them become more resilient, to also be more professional in the way they trained and they formed the security institutions and also their security forces. So there is a lot of work that we are doing with these kind of partners, and now focusing on is on supporting what we call partners at risk, partners in Europe that are more vulnerable to Russian interference. Here I'm talking about Moldova, I'm talking about Bosnia and Herzegovina, I'm talking about Georgia. These countries are very much influenced by Russia. Russia is trying to destabilize them. Russia is trying to bring them away from NATO, from working with NATO, because these are not members of NATO, these are partners. So these partnerships have become a top priority for us. Afghanistan. So I refer to the fact that the United States was attacked on 9/11, and this led to an unprecedented decision in NATO, because when the US was attacked, at that time, the Secretary General of NATO, George Robertson, basically he convened the North Atlantic Council, which is the most important decision body of NATO, and he proposed to invoke Article 5 of the Washington Treaty. When I spoke about the security and collective defense clause, one for all for one, that's what we did. We activated for the first time Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, which means that an attack against one, it's an attack against all. Based on the analysis, the security and intelligence analysis conducted by the United States at that time, there was a conclusion that the attacks against the United States, 9/11, were organized and orchestrated in Afghanistan. And this is why we went to Afghanistan. So we went to Afghanistan in a mission that lasted many years, over 15 years, where our purpose was to build Afghan security forces. The Taliban were thrown out of power, and we were very hard, not only the members of NATO, we created the largest coalition in the history with more than 50 nations working together in Afghanistan, creating and building from scratch Afghan security forces. Then what happened? What we all know, which is basically the Taliban went back to power, and instead of having the president of Afghanistan staying in the country, supporting the Afghan security forces that we had trained, basically he ran away, the Taliban took power, and then there was the chaotic exit of all our countries, basically over 50 countries that had to leave Afghanistan. It's true that we did not foresee this properly. So there were a number of issues that we could have anticipated. I spoke to you about anticipating what the Russians were preparing in Ukraine. Here there was a miscalculation by all of us. We didn't see it coming. So we had to face this chaotic exit from Afghanistan, where basically we left Afghanistan behind, losing the much progress that we actually helped Afghanistan build over 15 years, where children, women, girls, they had the job, they were going to school, and now we see the Taliban in power again. So this is very sad, because there was so much investment in in basically building a more modern Afghanistan with security forces. So that was a very sad experience for us. And we have tried to also learn the lessons from what basically we could not anticipate. And one of the lessons is the fact that we need to use intelligence better. We should have foreseen that. Also Crimea, the illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014. Many of our member states say, well, actually, we could have prevented what actually President Putin did last year. And maybe we could have. But Putin basically illegally annexed Crimea without us even noticing. He had already taken Crimea. So also one of the lessons learned from the annexation of Crimea is the fact that we need to have better intelligence. And this is one of the things that NATO has done. We have invested a lot in nurturing, collecting intelligence to help us understand what is going on, to deter and defend eventually if there is a need. So there are many, many lessons, Aaron, that we have learned from Afghanistan. And it also shows the fact that the United States really ensures and contributes to the security of Europe. But Europe also contributes to the security of the United States, of North America, Canada, and the United States. So if the United States will need the European partners, they will be there. Because basically what NATO gives the United States is to have friends. Our Secretary General, again, he was invited to address the US Congress a few years ago, and his main message to the US Congress was, it's good for the United States to have friends. Basically, what NATO offers to the United States is the possibility of projecting power into the Middle East, into so many areas of the world by having a military presence in many of the European member states of NATO, including Turkey. You spoke about Turkey also. The US has an important military presence in Turkey, and this helps the United States project stability, project power. So by being in NATO, the US has friends, and it's key to have friends these days. Maybe always, it has always been important, but now more than ever.
It's certainly good to have friends. We all agree, and see it the same. Carmen, you talked about, in your opening remarks, the once in a generation, perhaps actually since 9/11, unity that is being experienced between large swaths, certainly, of the United States and Europe since the outbreak of war in Ukraine. It's interesting to look at some polling data. There was, a few months ago, a multi-country poll conducted by the European Council on Foreign Relations in Oxford, which showed that the prevailing view of Europeans, Brits, and Americans is for Ukraine to win the war, even if the conflict endures some time longer. That is undefined. And this position being backed by the belief that Ukraine must regain its territory if there is to be lasting peace. March, International Republican Institute, unrelated to the party, poll in Ukraine showed that nearly 3/4 of Ukrainians believe that their country will recover and maintain all their territory. So my question is, does the alliance share that view? And in the ultimate quest for peace, if peace is everyone's ultimate goal, what do you believe is the most effective way to bring the fighting to a decisive halt, and not just a brief intermission, a frozen conflict, on and off again conflict, but a real, true, lasting peace?
Yes, as you say, our priority here in our strategy is to help Ukraine achieve a fair, but also a sustainable peace in Ukraine. Because what we have to achieve is not only that there is peace in Ukraine, but also that Ukraine doesn't get attacked, it's not attacked again. So this is what is really at stake. And I fully agree, and this is why it's important to have the support of our citizens. We have to support Ukraine for as long as it takes, because this is about our own security. This is about the security of Ukraine, obviously, but it's also about the future security architecture and the rules-based international order. So President Putin, he doesn't need to rush, because, as you say, what he would be okay with, freezing this conflict. It will be another frozen conflict, like, for example, we have in Georgia. As you know, there are two provinces, two territories of Georgia occupied by Russia. There is also in Moldova, Transnistria is occupied by Russia. So this is a strategy of Russia to basically destabilize a number of neighbors and to prevent them from entering certain organizations, because as I said, even if in 2008 NATO promised Ukraine and Georgia that one day they will become members, they have to be at peace. You cannot basically import a conflict into the organization. So this is why it's so important to support Ukraine for as long as it takes, but more importantly, to try to have peace negotiations as early as possible, is to help Ukraine retake as much territory as possible, as fast as possible. Because this is what will lead to Ukraine to agree to sit at the negotiating table. So this is the key now. We speak about the spring offensive. This is what is at stake. This is what the whole Western community that is supporting Ukraine wants. It wants to see Ukraine retake as much as possible of its own territory that has been occupied by Russia, so that they can go and negotiate a peace agreement that, of course, Ukraine will have to decide what it looks like. We cannot decide for Ukraine. It's Ukraine that will decide when to enter peace negotiations. And, of course, also Russia has to agree. So it's the timing is key here. And this is why all the members of NATO are really working hard to give the tools to Ukraine to basically be ready to retake as much as possible, territory as much as possible. So we need to try to avoid a fatigue, because we see also the impacts of this crisis, this military conflict, and the fact that it's Russia that has created a world economic crisis. It's Russia that has occupied another territory. And here we need to continue to be united, which has been our strength so far, to basically try to end and bring an end to this conflict as early as possible.
The same IRI poll I mentioned just recently showed that 82% of Ukrainians support joining NATO, which in itself is also telling. It's a drastic change from before Russia's 2022 and 2014 attacks, before which support for membership in Ukraine was generally below 50%, and if you go further back, significantly below 50%. However, with President Zelensky now having formally applied for NATO membership, it's clear where Ukrainians see their future. I'm curious how NATO sees it, particularly, and this is the sensitive aspect of it, how do you square the circle with regard to Crimea, right? We're talking about an area that, when you're weighing that Ukraine is adamant it will recover all of its territories, while you have to also consider to Russia for its Black Sea fleet based in Crimea. How do we square that circle, and how does that look like for, to your point, countries joining NATO have to have their territory be integral under their control. So I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on that. And I know it's a bit complicated, but we're all, these are the kind of topics that we really need to learn about. So we appreciate your advice.
Thank you so much. Well, as you say, it's very, very complicated. And as I said earlier, in 2008, NATO promised Ukraine that they will become a member of NATO. And it's very interesting because I was at that summit in 2008, and President Putin was also at that NATO summit, because I told you about the close partnership that we had. So President Putin was in Bucharest when all NATO heads of state and government decided, well, one day Ukraine and Georgia will become members. So when I spoke about transparency, we had nothing to hide. We were discussing with President Putin, after our meeting, Ukraine has applied, Georgia have applied, they have the right to become members, but of course they will have to meet the requirements. So about Ukraine's membership, the rightful place for Ukraine is in the Euro-Atlantic community, it's in NATO. We have a very important summit in July in Vilnius, and our member states are already negotiating. In NATO, everything is decided by consensus. This shows the importance of the political role of NATO. So everything has to be decided by consensus. So by the time we get to the Vilnius summit, our nations will have an agreement on what to offer Ukraine and what kind of political relationship we want to have with Ukraine. And what I can tell you is that we cannot predict now what our 31 member states will decide in Vilnius, but what I can tell you is that whatever they decide will be to continue to support Ukraine and to help Ukraine become a member of NATO when there is peace, when there are, the necessary reforms. So that's what our nations are working on. Then the issue of Crimea, well, for us is an illegal annexation, but it will have to be, since when Ukraine joins NATO, it will be an Ukraine at peace. Ukraine will have decided what its territorial integrity means like. So this is not for others to decide, it's for Ukraine to decide, but for us, we have said very clearly, all the members of NATO, we will never recognize the illegal annexation of Crimea. But, you know, when there will be peace negotiations, Ukraine will be in a position to decide what peace looks like. And we hope that that will be soon, because we all want that, basically that peace to arrive as soon as possible. And then we will have Ukraine one day joining NATO, as we promise Ukraine in front of President Putin. 2008. It's amazing how history evolves. And also when NATO approved its previous strategic concept, I spoke that last year in Madrid, we approved a new strategic concept, usually is valid, is the political strategy of NATO for a decade. In 2010, we approved the previous one, and it was in a summit in Lisbon in Portugal, and President Medvedev was there. So, you know, so we have always been transparent to Russia, and everything we built together has been destroyed and undermined by Russia itself. So, yeah.
That destruction and undermining is also, I think, the best marketing for NATO for other countries to join it, because, you know, when you look at countries like Finland and also in Ukraine previously, the populations were much more wary about getting involved in NATO, of applying for membership, and each Russian military incursion into its neighbors just makes its broader neighborhood less certain of their future outside of a collective security treaty. So they're sort of their own worst enemies on that, which is very interesting to observe.
Thank you, Aaron, for what you're saying. I have seen many things in NATO. I have seen NATO working closely with Russia. I have seen Russia becoming a potential adversary, now an enemy. And one of the more striking things that I have seen and experienced in NATO is what happened with Finland and Sweden. Is the fact that the public opinion, the citizens of Finland were against joining NATO. They were a neutral country, and Sweden the same. And from one day to another, the public opinion completely changed. They changed. When I spoke to you about how the threat perception has evolved in NATO along its history, the same happened in Finland and Sweden. They wanted to be protected by the umbrella that NATO provides. The fact that you wake up in the morning and you know that you are protected by 30 other countries, you know that you will have the United States, the most powerful nuclear power in the alliance, that you will be protected, you will be able to have peace and not military conflict. So what has happened with Finland, seeing Finland joining NATO and soon seeing Sweden joining NATO, is one of the most incredible and impressive experiences that I have lived so far in working in this organization, and the fact that now they want to be protected by the alliance. Yeah.
I have one more question here, and then we'll take a few audience questions. So anybody who has a question may want to start lining up. I think we'll bring the mic here in front, and then please, we'll work through the line. But my last question here before we open for audience Q&A brings it back to the U.S. Since the start of the war in Ukraine, Pew Research polling has showed that Americans have expressed increased wariness about involvement in world affairs more broadly. A majority, 55%, say that the U.S. should pay less attention to problems overseas and concentrate on problems at home, compared with 43% who say it's best for our country to be active in world affairs. Before Russia's invasion, it was about 50-50, so I think that the war has spread anxiety also in our country about international engagement. The positive, the good news is that NATO is still popular in the United States. Americans view NATO positively at around 62% compared to negatively around 35%. So since support for NATO in particular is more popular among Americans than international engagement more broadly, I was wondering if you had a few words about why you might think that it's important for Americans to be engaged in the world and how that connects back to NATO and its role.
Especially for the US, as I was saying earlier, it's so important to be in multinational organizations, because this is how you make friends and how you can work closely together. So for the United States, it's really key to forge unity to achieve its objectives and to have Europe, and North America working together. So here the key is work with the civil society in the United States, to have education, to have universities explaining to young people why our security is really linked and why it's important that the United States remains extremely committed to the European security, because this will contribute to the security of the United States. So that's what is really important, is education, so that people understand what is at stake and why for a country like the United States it's important to be in organizations like NATO, organizations like the United States, like the United Nations, but working very, very closely with partners and allies, because the security is global.
Thank you very much. We'll open it up to some audience Q&A. Go ahead, Patrick. Everyone, please introduce yourself and then the question. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this panel. Patrick Misiewicz, World Affairs Council. And I'm going to do with a comment and a question. Russian invasion of Ukraine is run on a plethora of legitimizing arguments of why invasion was unavoidable, including discuss NATO expansion of Warsaw Pact countries. Those arguments can be discussed forever, but it comes from the same root source. The Russian strategic thinking that is run on paranoia that nations are after them and their resources. Now, as a Polish American, I grew up in post-Soviet Poland in the city of Bydgoszcz, that housed a NATO Joint Force Training Center, a headquarters that later became a news topic. A Kh-55 missile was found just outside of the city, a missile that is nuclear capable that landed 500 kilometers from Belarus. Having such missile landing near NATO headquarters brings a question. If Russia is escalating rhetoric of nuclear escalation by signaling with such an event, is NATO ready for it?
Of course, we are ready for it. This is why we have increased our deterrence, and we have also reinforced our military presence in the eastern part of the alliance, to basically tell President Putin, don't mess with us. So be very careful so that nothing happens, so that there is not an escalation of the war into NATO's territory. So absolutely, we are prepared for that. But what is key is that we don't have to, basically the success of our strategy would be to be successful with deterrence, as we did with the Soviet Union, so that we don't have to defend, so that we don't have to enter into a conflict with Russia. This is the key of our strategy, is to support Ukraine, but to prevent an escalation. So, and it's important to basically continue to deter Russia, and Russia knows that very well. And this is why there have been incidents, because of course there is so much military activity in the Black Sea, over the Black Sea. We are basically conducting military exercises, NATO is conducting military activities, and Russia is operating. So we are very close to each other, and it's very important to be very, very careful, because if there is an incident, this could mean an extension of the war in Ukraine to NATO. So of course we are ready. Of course we are telling President Putin, and we see the nuclear rhetoric, as you were saying, from Russia, and we are watching this very closely. This is completely unacceptable, what Russia is doing with its nuclear rhetoric, but also Russia knows that NATO is a nuclear alliance, so this is why we will be ready. Have no doubt that NATO will be ready in any case. This is what we are.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Christina Slezinska. I'm the Executive Director of the European American Chamber of Commerce here in Florida. Geopolitics is something I'm really interested in. And obviously the war in Europe is a huge issue. I have two questions. One of them has to do with President Putin. So you talked a lot about that partnership that existed at the time. You talked about 2008 meeting where Putin was present in the room where that agreement was that Ukraine might be joining NATO at some stage.
He was at the summit. He was not in the room.
Oh, okay, he was at the summit.
He was at the summit.
But he
so
knew.
We had a meeting.
He knew. And Medvedev knew. So they knew. But they changed their mind, obviously. So could you maybe talk a little bit about the vision? Because as a military alliance, you need to know your enemy. And talk a little bit about his vision of the Europe that he has issues with, and that he would like to stop, because that is, I think, one of the crux of the issue. So the other question has to do with NATO. So the US has for many years said that NATO was not prepared, that European countries were not investing enough into the military. And I remember when I was living there, many of my friends were happy they didn't go to military service because it was stopped. And as a result, in Europe, we had a wonderful quality of life because investments were made into public transportation, infrastructure, things like that, and not into the military. That has changed. In the past 3 years, it has totally changed. So do you think that moving forward, we're going to continue having in Europe professional militaries, or are we going to be going back for a range of reasons to military service?
Thank you. The first question is very difficult to answer because you don't know what President Putin has in his mind. But obviously, he was in favor of, at least he pretended, of a partnership with NATO. And then he saw, we don't know, but we saw him changing absolutely. And then saying, okay, so now I'm not going to allow more of the neighbors of Russia to become members of NATO. And this is why in 2008, he entered Georgia. He was already in Transnistria. So obviously his long-term strategy reflects a pattern, an assertive pattern of preventing countries to be free, to be independent, and to have the right to choose. And this is what he has done in Georgia. This is what he has done in Moldova. This is what he has done in Ukraine. So, and this is something that, of course, is not acceptable. It's completely against the international, basically, regulations. And NATO is an organization, as an institution of democracies, has to respect the rule of law. And what Putin has done is going from a period where he was playing with the security architecture that was built together with Russia, is to basically undermine it and destroy it. So it has been his choice. It has been him who has basically undermined the partnership built together, and has decided to try to prevent other nations from deciding their security affiliation. So that's very serious, and that's something that democratic nations that have strong values cannot accept. So and I really think that this is part of a long-term, Soviet mentality, but of course we are not in his mind. On burden sharing, so sharing the burden, I agree with you. Absolutely, what you said is correct in the sense that for many decades, for many years, the United States, which is the biggest, strongest military member of the organization, has pushed European partners to invest more in security, to spend more on security. In 2014, as a consequence of the first war launched by Russia against Ukraine, we all decided on a defense investment pledge that was at a summit in Wales in the United Kingdom. And that defense investment pledge has 3 C's. One is cash, so 2% of the GDP has to be spent on defense. The second cash is contributions, how much you contribute to NATO's missions and operations and activities. And the third is capabilities, which military capabilities you need to develop in order to be able to deter and defend if necessary. So from peace to crisis, to be ready, from peace to crisis to conflict. And all European nations are investing more in security. If we will return to military conscription, I don't know. I think that each nation will decide its own way to go. But now what our Secretary General wants to achieve at the new summit, at the next summit in Vilnius, is a new defense investment pledge. So 2% of the GDP should be the floor, not the ceiling anymore. So the minimum requirement for all nations to spend on defense is 2%, and then do more also on contributions and capabilities. So there is, all nations now agree that we cannot take our security for granted anymore, and this is why we have to invest more in security, because if we don't have security, we don't have education. If we don't have security, we don't have economic prosperity. So it's at the heart of everything we can do in our societies. And I think that that is now being seen in our member states, in our countries, the fact that we don't have security for granted anymore, which is something that was not the case, a few years ago. So all European nations are investing more. We don't see, of course, at the end of the Cold War, we were living off the dividends of peace. So European nations, it was not the case of the United States, but European nations declined their investments in defense because we enjoyed a period, 3 decades of peace. So our nations were investing less, spending less on defense. This completely changed in 2014. So this is why I speak about the war in Ukraine has not started last year. It started in 2014. That was the wake-up call for the European members of NATO and also for Canada. We have to invest more. We have to spend more on defense. So I hope this answers your question.
Good morning. Thank you very much for being here. My name is Mike Lenigan. I have the privilege of teaching in the social sciences, as we call them, the unnatural sciences, here in international relations and political science at the college. As your career reflects a rigor, an inspirational, ethical, and rigorous approach to interlocution through journalism, and then in your current role with regard to interlocuting, being the voice between the accuracy and representativeness and truth of the institution to which our country is a member and which we're acknowledging and enjoying the privilege of today. What would you identify, at least for a professor who emphasizes his students basically seek to base their insights, no matter how you spell the word, INSIGHT or INCITE, on facts? What would you identify as the 5 most trustworthy sources of information by which citizens, as well as scholars and others, make decisions at this time in the world, not just in the United States?
Ooh, that's a difficult question. Yes, sources have become so important more than ever because the truth, the difference between truth and lies are so blurred these days. So I think that mainstream media continues to be a respectful source. It's a source that our media, our mainstream media, they are double-checking information. So they continue to be, I would say, one of the privileged sources. Then institutions like national institutions, but also institutions like NATO. We work very hard to be transparent in our communications, to be credible, to be respected, to respect our values, and to focus on telling our story and not get distracted by disinformation, while we need to understand what is out there in the information space and understand the increase of hostile information activities. So our institutions, our civil society, we work very, very closely with civil society organizations, small institutions, NGOs that are helping other members of the civil society become more resilient against the threat of disinformation, for example, so that our young students can think twice before they amplify something. So we are working now, for example, very closely with the United Nations, speaking about building partnerships and reinforcing our partnerships as a consequence of the war in Ukraine. We need to work with our young people so that they double-check sources. So how many did I tell you?
3 so far.
4.
Okay.
We have done 3. So then, well, yes, I don't know. It's about working together to be more resilient. You have 2 more?
Yeah, I have also like a specific thoughts and additions to that too, and I'll be concise in this. But like Carmen's not going to want to specifically endorse like a media outlet, this or that, right or left. But what you can do is, if you're looking for good, trusted sources of information, You can look at like the wire services, right? So you can look at the AP, right? You can look at the AFP in France. You can look at DPA in Germany. These are sort of the foundations upon which the news is written. And when the wire services report the news, they are just going to report like what happened, when, to whom, with whom, and they're not going to put narrative on it. And then people buy their, organizations buy their stories. I'm sure you know this, sir, but just, as the answer, organizations buy their stories and then build narratives into it. So if you're interested in like just the objective facts of what happened and when and why, and maybe even the why would be like not completely all there, but what happened certainly, the wire services are great. And that's going to be as close to just like straight facts as you're going to find. And it's usually free. I mean, it depends, but you can just Google it and you can search AP, AFP, DPA, stuff like that. And that's a very good way of finding information. And then you can choose your preferred media outlets after that to look at a bit more narrative and opinion, but on just the facts, I would say that's a good.
And that's what I meant by mainstream media. So is the really the respected media outlets that are more independent in a way. So because they are very fact-based, like the news agencies. And this is where I grew, at a news agency where the facts are really the key. And this is what I have been defending within my organization, fact-based information. Let's take media, let's take representatives of civil society to show them what we do so that they can tell the NATO story. And we are doing this more and more with young people. We are taking, content creators to a U.S. aircraft carrier. We are taking them to NATO so that they can speak with the NATO Secretary General about issues that they care about, like climate change, because many young people may not know that NATO has an important role in dealing with the security consequences and implications of climate change, because climate change has implications for our security, for the way we will be conducting conflicts will take place in the future, and how we will have to be prepared to deal with those conflicts, and how we have to move our armies to green energies. So there is so much that NATO is working on, not only deterring and increasing our deterrence and defense against Russia, but also be prepared to deal with terrorism and emerging and disruptive technologies. As I said, cyber, hybrid. So there are many things that NATO has to be prepared for on top of Ukraine.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We're running a little bit short on time, but I see that there's 4. Don't worry, we'll get to you. I see we have 4 people left asking questions. Three. So maybe we can take 2 together, and then maybe 1 and then 2 together, if we can do that to move them quickly.
Absolutely.
That's okay. So yeah.
Good morning. My name is Mario Mullins. I'm an instructor at Miami-Dade College. I'm a political science major and a former US AID. I was wondering what, if anything, can NATO do, since you depend on the willingness of the population to apply, but to help facilitate those willing applicants to expedite their membership, and particularly the ones that are in some kind of question, like you mentioned, Moldova, Bosnia, Georgia, and perhaps even Serbia. And then going beyond, these are the difficult questions of which country wants to do how much and how much they can actually comply with the requirements of membership. How does NATO perceive the position that Hungary has taken? And last but not least, if the purpose of the war is to guarantee a peace after the war and create a deterrent so that there won't be another war, why not expedite the delivery of air power to Ukraine with whatever constraints are necessary?
These are many questions in one.
I know.
Which
I tried to be brief.
These are many questions in one. So to support countries, vulnerable countries in Europe, like you mentioned, Moldova, Georgia, Bosnia Herzegovina, is to help them speed up the reforms, is to work with them on what we call capacity building across the board. So this is what NATO can do. This is what NATO is doing. This is also what other organizations are doing, like the European Union. So this is really a team effort, and to prepare them to be ready to enter the European Union and NATO in the future, if they so wish.
Exactly.
So it's about working with them every day, help them become more resilient against potential security threats. The second question, there was the second question?
Hungary?
Hmm?
Hungary?
Well, Hungary. So NATO is a very specific organization in the sense that we are not like the European Union that can't take sanctions against member states. So NATO respects, Hungary has a government that has been democratically elected. And what is important to see is the fact that Hungary participates and supports all decisions taken in NATO. Otherwise, those decisions will not be taken because, as I said, NATO works by consensus. So Hungary, of course, is a full member of the alliance and contributes to all the decisions. So whatever we do with Ukraine, for example, will be supported by Hungary.
And the air power?
And the air power, that's for the member states to decide, because NATO has trained, NATO members have trained the security forces of Ukraine for many, many years. And this is also, of course, we have seen how the Ukrainian security forces and army has been fighting, the courage that you cannot teach maybe, but we have been training them for many, many years. And this is also why Ukraine was so prepared to fight when the moment came to fight. Right. So this is the result of many, many, many years of investment, but it's not NATO that is going to provide air defense to Ukraine. That's for our member states to eventually decide to do on a bilateral basis. Thank you.
Thank you.
And for the last two questions, maybe we can get them at once, and then we can wrap up, because I apologize for going a bit over.
Hello, my name is Apollinaire Sebastian Mendoza, and I'm a student here in the Miami-Dade Honors College at the North Campus. And I wanted to discuss with you if you have any solutions for war fatigue. We do have a disadvantage against many of our authoritarian nations that we have to go through elections. And the will of the people have to stay consistent with Ukrainian goals, especially among our youth and politicians. And I wanted to see if you had any solutions or advice.
I wish I would have solutions, but what I can tell you against the war fatigue, what is important is to continue to talk about is that people understand why it's important to continue to support Ukraine. What is really at risk and what is at stake is the fact that, what happens in Ukraine is important for our security. So it's about education, it's about understanding what we are fighting for and why we cannot allow to have a war fatigue in Ukraine. It's about keeping that public support. As you were saying, support for NATO is high in the United States, but support on supporting Ukraine may decline. And that's what we thought, with the winter coming and, inflation going up, that's what we thought it was going to happen. And we have managed to keep the public support for what we are doing with Ukraine. And we need to sustain that public support because it's all about public support. Our politicians will decide and will take decisions based on what our citizens think. This is what we have seen in Finland, going from being a neutral nation for decades for, Sweden, to deciding, okay, now we apply to become a member of the most successful alliance, security alliance in the world, so NATO. So it's about talking, it's about talking about sharing information and not allowing a war fatigue. And it's also about supporting Ukraine win this war as soon as possible.
Thank you.
And to add, as a shameless self-promotion, a great antidote for war fatigue is having events like these and having Carmen come to Miami and talk to people about why this is important, about why these issues are relevant as they've ever been, and to allow her to also talk to all of you and to answer the questions. So we're really happy that you came out, and thank you for being here.
And now you understand also better. So it's not about supporting because you have your own opinion. And of course you are free of thinking whatever you want, but at least you hear what we are doing, and maybe, you will also amplify. So it's about you telling also your story in your way on why this is important.
Thank you.
Thank you to you.
Good
The last
morning.
question.
Yes, I'll be brief.